Does every cause have an effect, and does every effect have a cause? Well, if you take this argument back far enough, then you kind of get back to the beginning of the universe. And the question we're addressing in this series of discussions, which is, does God exist? This is Eric Slawick, aka the UWM pen guy for all my UWM friends.
This is Alex Burks.
And today we're going to do part 3 in our series on does God exist? And we're going to address the Kalaam Cosmological Argument, which we may have meant to do last time, but we did a good job of showing people why it matters that we ask this question. So, Alex, if you would like to take us into the steps of the argument, here we go.
Yeah, that'd be great. So my thought process is we'd go through a couple of them. Maybe we will only get to one or two, but I was thinking we'd go from the most analytical to the most emotionally palatable. So the Kalaam Cosmological Argument is what I think is probably the best argument for the existence of God. I, the evidentialist, is an naturalist. Eric, the presuppositionalist, and see what he thinks, which I don't think he'll agree, or I don't think he'll disagree. Hopefully, yeah, you'll agree with the argument. So the argument is, A, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. B, the universe began to exist. C, the universe has a cause for its existence. So might seem pretty basic or like nothing special, but think about what that means, right? If everything that is created has a cause, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Again, that cause would have to be outside of the universe. So a being outside of the universe who's acting upon it, who's creating it, would have to have all of, or basically every attribute we would attribute to God. Therefore, if all of those things are true, the conclusion of those premises is that the universe had a cause. That cause would be God.
Yeah. And I mean, as you were suggesting in our first episode or first segment of this, I believe that this is theism in the broadest sense, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, to, I guess, press this theism point a little, in the 90s, there was a physicist who, I believe, imploded his career because he wrote a book called The Omega Point. And I read this book when I was an atheist because I was very lost emotionally, personally, looking for, after I had departed from my childhood Catholicism, I kind of collapsed into a very dark and lonely place, and any semblance of an inkling of possibility that there could be a rational belief in God, I was ready to hold on to. And not that I'm qualified to go into the details of the physics, but I think it was basically something like a compressed singularity at the beginning of time that had some sort of mechanical processing or something broadly that looks like agency, at least from a certain perspective, or, agency, the ability to make decisions and make plans and such. And if I remember right, it sounded like this is something that if you try real hard, you could call this something like a god. Mm-hmm. First of all, he got annihilated in the scientific community because apparently it is essentially heretical in professional scientific publications to suggest that pure, unadulterated, naturalistic materialism, nothing but the material universe, physical forces, cause and effect linked to nothing, verboten, heretic, gone. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting in and of itself. But where would you put an idea like the Omega Point in the Calam argument? Is the Calam, does that satisfy the conditions of the Calam argument if you have some compression of purely physical factors that can actually resemble a first cause?
No.
No. Okay. I'm curious. Explain why.
I would say that the issue that physics gets to is that we have no concept or no idea what happened before the Big Bang. Because like the issue, if you ask physicists what happened before the Big Bang, it would be like asking a Christian what happened before God spoke light into existence. It's kind of unfathomable because there is no matter, there is no time, there's no space. There is nothing to create nothing, if that makes sense. So to say that there was somehow a physical proponent to what took place, or somehow some physical proponent before the Big Bang occurred, would be kind of a bizarre supposition.
I actually remember having a conversation with a young atheist at UWM who, when I pressed him, and this guy, if I'm not jumbling up people here, I believe he was the one that had extensively studied Answers in Genesis's literal creationist materials.
Mm.
And we kind of did a dance, like we played his home field advantage, then my home field advantage.
Mm.
And his was science. Obviously, mine was Bible and theology. And when we got to the science part, if this is the same guy, forgive me, everyone, if I'm wrong, but I pressed him on what was before the Big Bang. And I believe his quote was almost word for word, well, that's a meaningless question. And I think that, yeah, I mean, it makes sense from their perspective why it would be, but it's like, oh my goodness, as a presuppositionalist, I'm sitting here thinking, well, we just arrived at your assumption. We just arrived at the thing that you cannot prove and do not care to even try to prove. Because I would say every human philosophical system needs that unproven starting point. Otherwise, you can't function.
And I also think the issue that a lot of people make is they try to, because the science is very complicated, and it's not to say it's inconclusive, but like I was saying, science isn't objective. So you have so many theorems and different ideas of how it works, and the math is like hyper complex, and someone does the math and they get this equation, and someone else does the math and they get another equation. It's super complicated, right? But like at the end of the day, the question that we're asking isn't a scientific one, it's a philosophical one. How can something come from nothing? And how can complexity come from oblivion? It kind of doesn't make sense, and anyone who tries to make scientific positations here is kind of sidestepping the issue of how can something come from nothing? And I would say that is impossible. I think something coming from nothing is impossible.
So would you say the Calam argument is basically saying that according to our experience, which is, and by experience, I mean literally all recorded observations of anything in human history, we have not a single example of where anything that, what was it again? Anything that has a beginning has a cause.
Yes.
Like every example we have of everything in every field of life everywhere.
Yes.
Everything that has a beginning has a cause.
Precisely.
So I'm trying to play the hypothetical atheist here and say, because I heard Dawkins once in a moment of surprising humility, he actually said, we know frighteningly little about the universe. We've got our little bubble and our little bit of knowledge. And from their perspective and their long scale ages of time, you're talking billions and billions of years. So he even, multiplied it by that. And he might make the argument that, well, I mean, our observation is such a limited field to work with. So how do we know that just to make this extreme, 1 trillion years from now, we won't have discovered a thing that had a beginning but no cause? Or does the Calam argument say that's a logical impossibility?
I mean, that's like saying when we figure out that dogs can fly? Do we build them little like space suits so they can fly? It's like that. Okay, it's like, what are you talking about? It doesn't matter. So when we get to that point, then we can address that. First, we need to get to a point where we have an idea of something that can begin without a cause. But until we do, I would say that the argument holds up. I would also say that the advances in the 20th century field of mathematics and physics. Do you see how it proves this fact? Because Einstein was looking for he was pro the idea of an eternal universe. So therefore, it needed no cause, and the universe could in effect be God, meaning it was the unmoved mover or something like that, or it was the absolute ground of reality or something like that. The universe was a brute fact. But everything we know from modern physics says that the universe had a beginning. And so if the universe had a beginning, then the Calam argument begins to take force. So actually, in a lot of ways, Einstein and the other people who helped us get to this point actually did a great favor for the theists in the room.
And so would you maybe make the argument that, as a matter of fact, all of the history of science, because we kind of alluded to the beginning of this argument in our last episode, all the history of science seems to say that the more we learn about science, the stronger this argument is going to get?
I would say so. I would say that the more evidence we find more dead space where science kind of has to throw up its hands and say, we actually don't really know what's going on here. So I'm not saying that means that Jesus, you can't just go from there to insert Jesus in and say, all right, we've solved the theistic question and we've solved the question of religion. But what I am saying is, anyone, as I've heard it quoted, anyone who puts their faith or who marries the science of this age will be a widow in the next. And so the point we're making as Christians is that Christianity, no matter how much the science fluctuates, is the firm foundation of the believer. And therefore, it's just as true 2,000 years ago as it will be in 2,000 years, because all of this kind of scientific tinkering, as Christians, we would say, bring it on. It can only further and further aid the Christian unto the glory of God.
And Ken Ham he's a popular level speaker, so don't take this as Answers in Genesis is sort of heavyweight word. But he, from a Christian perspective, makes the point that you have a choice between God's eternal infallible word and man's ever-changing opinions, which is kind of what you were just saying.
Yeah.
That by definition, I would actually, I have a Hellenist friend who is one of my other co-hosts for the various podcasts, which, to plug those episodes too, we get into this kind of stuff too from obviously wildly different perspectives.
Sure.
And Lou actually, in Hellenism, he's informed me that it was, and for the few there are today, is chaos and order, and the interplay between the two are actually at the root of the universe in Hellenism. They're the uncaused cause. It's not Zeus.
Sure.
It's more basic than Zeus. And if you think about that, first of all, it's kind of yin-yang, which is ironic because they're on opposite sides of the world, those civilizations. But also, that feels to me like the definition of an unstable foundation.
I think that it doesn't kick the ball back further enough because it presupposes something. And I mean, I suppose you could say that the chaos and order are eternal, but it kind of, like most things with the polytheistic religions, clashes with modern science. So I would say that, I mean, I'm sure if Lou was here, he could nuance it endlessly and we could have a very productive conversation. But the base ground that there's chaos and order would mean that there's something and something, but where did those two things come from? They can't be eternal.
And I would actually loop it around and suggest that my understanding, and I'm gonna be geeky here again, and we're different fanboys of franchises, but in Star Trek, in Next Generation, there was an episode where they played on this quantum variance idea, and Lieutenant Worf like multiplied infinitely in the known universe to a degree that within like a week the universe would literally be crushed by Worfs. Which is, that's classic geek stuff, but it makes the point about how if you don't understand quantum mechanics in particular, and another co-host of mine, Joel's taught me a bit about quantum mechanics, and you can take a responsible approach to it, and you can take a wild approach to it. And that universe full of Worfs is obviously a fiction writer having the line in the script that says science time, and then building on that. They do that in Doctor Who too, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So like, and it's fun, but it's kind of a thought experiment also that logically, like we were implying in the last program, detached from any foundation of sound, well-guided reason, how do you stop modern science from going back to chaos and the endless interplay between chaos and order, or something much wilder than that being at the root of existence?
Well, I think it's interesting. I know very little about quantum mechanics. I admit I know super little, but my understanding of like quarks and stuff at the very base of what we know about matter, right? What I do know is it's absolutely random, and you can have quarks doing things that we would basically quantify as magic, and we don't understand them at all. So we know that they exist. The smallest physical unit that we can imagine. The very small. We know that they're absolutely random. They do very, very weird things all the time, and it kind of gets you thinking. It's like, well, how do you have stability in a world where it's composed of absolute anarchy? And even to the scientist, if you have, neutrons or energy moving in such a way that it can produce a universe ex nihilo, out of nothing, how is that universe stable? And how are the laws of physics constant? Because we know that universes don't just go sprouting at every moment randomly. Like the quark here isn't going to spread a universe. I could try, I could spend 50 million years kind of sitting here. A universe probably isn't going to spawn up out of nowhere. A puppy probably isn't just going to spawn randomly just in the middle of the air. Science doesn't work that way, so it kind of beggars the question, why did that happen once? And why does it maintain order in a way that's, we're able to study? Which is a fascinating question in and of itself. But even so, it continues to grow in complexity, even to something like life, which is insane to think about. These quarks and atoms somehow, because at the end of the day, this is what the atheist claim is. The quarks and atoms, the neutrons, the energy, somehow composed themselves into order. And then they themselves composed themselves into life. And then they compose themselves into consciousness, which this happens sometimes with atheists who are honest. It gets super spiritual really quick. I mean, it really does get very, very, very religious, but not in any formal sense, in a sort of the magic of the stardust that you're composed of is beautiful in the way that it moves and dances in the light of the meteors. And it's strange.